You know, I know that most of you realize that I have an odd sense of humor. I'm the kind of weird person that likes dad jokes. I like slapstick comedy. I like dumb things. I have a very punny sense of humor, probably. And because of that, I like silly things that maybe I shouldn't, I don't know, but I love Mel Brooks movies. Are any of you proud enough to admit that you love Mel Brooks? I've loved Mel Brooks movies for a long time, and one of my personal favorites is Young Frankenstein. It makes me laugh so hard I cry every time, I think. But one of my favorite scenes in Young Frankenstein is when Dr. Frankenstein, not Frankenstein, shows up on the platform to his new home in somewhere, who knows. And Igor is there waiting on the platform for him, right? And it goes through the whole name thing. It's pronounced Frankenstein, not Frankenstein. Do you pronounce it Froderick? No, it's Frederick. But after they get their names figured out, Igor takes his bag and starts walking towards the staircase down off the platform, right? And he pulls out this cane, and he starts hobbling down the stairs with the cane. And then when he gets to the bottom, he turns around to Frankenstein and he holds the stick up at him and he says, "Walk this way." And Dr. Frankenstein looks at him, puzzled for a second, and shakes the cane at him. And so Dr. Frankenstein takes the cane and hobbles down the stairs just like Igor did. Walk this way. This morning I want to talk to you about 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 through 6. If you don't have your app open to it, you can open up your Bibles to 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 through 6. But I want to talk about John making a similar statement. John gives a similar challenge of walk this way. Now, I know a lot of you, well, guys like Randy, you hear walk this way and all you can think of is Aerosmith, but we're not going there today. We're not going to Aerosmith. But how do you walk like Jesus? John challenges us that if we really want to know Jesus, if we want to claim that we know Jesus, then we have to walk the way he does. He writes it this way. Again, 1 John chapter 2, starting in verse 3. We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Whoever says, "I know him," but does not do what he commands is a liar. And the truth is not in that person. But if anyone obeys his word, love for God is truly made complete in them. This is how we know we are in him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. And if you look at different translations, some of them say live, some of them say walk as Jesus did. But the idea is the same. If you want to claim to know Jesus, then you had better be able to move and act like Jesus. You had better be able to walk his way. And that's John's challenge. It's not a joke. It's not flip it. It's not just a way to be silly. When he says you have to be like Jesus, he is giving you the ultimate challenge, the ultimate command. He's not trying to just say something to sound nice. But if you want to really know Jesus, you would better be able to act like him. The thing that I love about this, the thing that I thought was so impressive about what John was doing is that he's not just telling you to do this, he's living it out. He's showing you by example what it means to live like Jesus. And the reason I say that, if you look at that first verse again, or if you look at verse 3 again, what does he say? He says that if you want to say you know him, right? We know that we have come to know him if we keep his commands. Now, when you read that, does that sound familiar at all to you? This is John sometime after he has written his gospel, right? There's debate. There's always debate over biblical things, right? But some people think that John was written maybe in the 50s, literally the 50s, not like 1950s. But that it was written somewhere around between 55 and 60. And then there are other people who think that John was written somewhere later, maybe in the 70s or 80s, possibly as late as the 90s, somewhere in the early 91, 92 AD area. But either way, no matter when you think he wrote his gospel, these 3 letters are coming somewhere after that. And he knows, he understands that Jesus has already given this command to follow his commands, to follow God's commands. I mean, when you take a look at John's gospel, in chapters 14 and 15, this statement is said numerous times over and over again in different ways. In John chapter 14 and verse 15, he says, "If you love me," Jesus speaking, "if you love me, keep my commands." Later on in chapter 14, he says, in verse 21, "Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love them and show myself to them." Further on in 15, John chapter 15, verse 10, he says, "If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love." What I'm getting at is that John heard this directly from Jesus. John, who followed Jesus for at least 3 years, who lived with Jesus, followed Jesus, went where he went, ate what he ate, did all his life with Jesus, heard him say, "You must follow my commands. If you really love me, if you really love the Father, then you will do what the Father commands." And now, either you can say it's 10 years later, you can say it's 40 years later, whatever it is, John is still doing that. John is still living that out. He is still following the command to share Jesus with the people around him. He's living it out. He's giving you the example of what it means to truly live like Jesus. John is continuing the teaching that he got who knows how long ago when he spent time at the feet of the teacher. But then John goes into the argument about many will say that I know him. But he goes as far to say that if you don't live out the commands, you're a liar. See, unfortunately, people can be fake. People can be very untruthful. Maybe not a very good example, but I thought of it and it made sense to me. So, did any of you grow up watching Bill Nye the Science Guy? Bill Nye the Science Guy. Bill Nye the Science Guy. Right? It was fun watching him growing up as a kid. But somehow Bill Nye has become like this go-to science, I don't know. I don't want to say God because that's really bad. But, I mean, Bill Nye has become like this ultimate science authority. Bill Nye is a smart guy. He's much smarter than I am. But do you know what qualifications he has to be a science expert? He has a mechanical engineering degree, not putting that down. Mechanical engineering is fantastic. Like I said, that's still smarter than me. He has a mechanical engineering degree from Cornell University. But he got hired as a TV host because he could present science experiments to kids well. And because he became famous as a kids science presenter, people thought he knew what he was doing, and he became this science guy. Have any of you ever watched Rocky IV? In Rocky IV, there is this big, burly Russian guy, played by Dolph Lundgren. Dolph Lundgren is amazing. Did you know that Dolph Lundgren has not one, but 3 bachelor's degrees? He has a bachelor's degree from Washington State University in chemistry. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Sydney in Australia in, I believe, chemical engineering. And he has a degree from the Royal Institute in Sweden, in Stockholm. Again, that one I think is, I can't remember. It's another one to do with chemistry. And not only that, once he had accomplished all of those, he was offered a Fulbright scholarship to MIT. Now, I don't know if any of you know that, but it's pretty difficult to get a Fulbright scholarship, especially to MIT. Dolph Lundgren, this guy that we think of as an action hero, has more qualifications to be a science guy than Bill Nye does. You've got this one guy who learned a lot more than I did, but then pretended to be a science guy on TV. And you've got this science guy who learned a lot more than I ever could and learned to be a dumb guy on TV. You've got these two opposites, and they're learning to play each other because that's what we do. We have all had fake friends. Unfortunately, we have all been around people who like to talk a lot. They like to claim they can do a lot of things or that they know a lot of people. And then you know that those are the very people that you can never rely on because there's a whole lot of talk, but then not a lot of follow through. They may claim to know somebody or they may claim to have some kind of connection, but you know that that's just it's just a story that they've told you to be cool, right? And that's the thing that gets me about claiming to know people. Is most of the time that we do that, we claim to know people in order for us to be famous by association. Like we claim to have connections. We claim to be able to say, I know famous people, I know all these, not because of the people themselves. Like I can claim to know, I don't know, an actor or a musician. I can claim that I know a famous rock band. Growing up, my favorite band was from Sweden. And they very rarely came to the United States. And so every time that they did, I would go to any kind of concert that I could get to. I mean, I traveled long ways to get to these concerts just so I could see this band because they were my favorite and they were never around here. And so I could stand here and tell you, I know these guys. I know these 5 guys because I met them at least 3 times. But if you asked them, they would have absolutely no clue who I was. They would have no idea what I was talking about that I knew them because they'd be like, that's nice. We said hello to about 1,000 people that night. I'm sorry, I don't recognize you. That's the way we act. That's the way we pretend because we hope that if we know somebody, we claim to know Jesus and we claim that we are his followers, but that's all that it is. I know him. What good is that? What does that do besides make us a liar? Is there any benefit for us from that? Is there any benefit for Jesus for that? The whole point of claiming to know him is just so that we can say, I know somebody important. I know somebody who is famous. But that's not what Jesus wants. Unfortunately, we spend most of our time as Christians just trying to learn facts and figures. We try to acquire, we read this book as if it's a textbook, and there's a history exam, and we've got to remember dates and times, and I can remember June 6th. I promise, Trevor, I really do. I can remember December 7th. I can remember those things. But so much of our Christian life, what we would call discipleship or what we would call fellowship, we look at this, we read through it, and we just try to remember weird names of people and places and history and dates and all these things. And it's like we think that we're going to get to the gates of heaven and they're going to hand us this paper and you're just going to have to take a test to see if you know enough about Jesus. do you know where he was on this Sabbath? Or do you know who he healed? Or who was the mother of the man who he healed? Sometimes we feel like maybe they're going to give us a book and we have to write a 1,500-word essay about who Jesus was and how he impacted Western civilization. If you're like me, you're hoping it's a multiple choice test. I can at least guess halfway through. Or we spout off facts about Jesus as if we're reading the stats off of a basketball card or baseball card. We look at the Bible and we think, oh yeah, Jesus, he was 6'1", he was 180, he spoke Arabic, he had, depending on whose trading card, he had a white face or he had a brown face or he had long hair or short hair or blue eyes or brown eyes. We spout off these facts and hope that that's what's going to get us into heaven. Well, I knew him, right? I know him. I know what he's about. Unfortunately, that's what John is writing to. John is writing to a church, it's a fledgling church, it's a new church, it's trying to struggle to find its legs, and it's dealing with people who are trying to understand who Jesus is without learning from Jesus himself. And so sometimes people come in with strange ideas, and other people come in just because they want to be able to take things over, or they want to change things because they don't like them. The church is struggling, and there are people coming in saying that they have special knowledge or they have special experience. And because they have been given this special knowledge through a kind of magical revelation, or because they have experienced God through a mystical experience, they somehow have a better understanding of who God is. They know really who Jesus is. And they, because of that, again, going back to like those famous people, they think that they are closer to God because of those special things, that special knowledge, that special experience. And it's driving a wedge in the church. People are having a serious problem because not everybody gets these special revelations. Not everybody has those special experiences. And so does that mean that they're not really Christians? Does that mean that you have to do those things in order to be a true follower of Jesus? And John says, look, you can claim all you want. The funny thing is when John writes this, there are several different words in Greek that mean to know or knowledge, but the one that he specifically uses is gnosis, with a silent G at the beginning. The name that this group, the Gnostics, had taken, gnosis, special knowledge. And he says, you think you have special knowledge. You can claim to know God, but really you're a liar, because how does that really impact who you are? How does that really truly move who you have been to what Jesus wants you to be? Because all you're doing is building yourself up. All you're doing is making yourself sound good. But that doesn't do anybody any good. How do you really know Jesus? How do you really know not just facts and figures? How do you experience Jesus? How do you actually build a relationship? For the disciples, that was easy because they lived with him, they walked with him, they talked with him. They could actually ask him questions, and they could experience the healings that Jesus did. But then you and I are left here 2,000 years later, trying to build a relationship with a guy who lived, died, rose again, and went back up into heaven. And this church hadn't waited that long, but they were still trying to build a relationship with someone that they had never actually met. How do you come to know God? How do you know Jesus? And not just facts, not just figures, not just the periphery stuff. Because that's what it is. It's a relationship. I can stand up here and tell you all kinds of things about my wife. But none of you will ever know her like I do. Just like you all you have spouses, kids, friends, that you can tell me all kinds of facts about them, but that doesn't mean I will know them like you do. And John is saying, how do we move away from just people who talk a big game to people who actually truly know Jesus? Because just knowing those stats isn't good enough. Jesus himself said this. If you remember back in Matthew's gospel, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, he says that many, or not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. Jesus himself knew and understood there's a lot of people who would try to claim him, who would try to say, yeah, I know him. You know, he's my father's brother's uncle's former roommate. There are a lot of people who would try to claim Jesus, but Jesus himself would say, wait a minute, when did we ever meet? When did we ever spend time together? When did you ever invite me over for a meal? Or simply ask me into your home? When did you do any of these things? Jesus knew and understood and tried to explain to people that you can't just make empty claims. You can't just throw out yeah, I know him. Because if you do, Jesus can throw that back in your face and say, no, you're a liar. I never knew you. All right. I know that's a lot of negative, but how do we move into really knowing Jesus then? How do we become a part of life with him? How do we live like Jesus did? How do we become like a disciple? Maybe we can't be an apostle who actually saw and worked with Jesus, but how do we become a disciple who really has a relationship with Jesus? Well, first of all, I think we've got to move past just imitating Jesus or mimicking Jesus. Again, you know, I'm a child of the 80s and 90s, and so if you remember back, I think it was, mid-90s, there was this lovely commercial, and I can't sing. I will never try to sing. But there was this commercial that said, I want to be like Mike. Sometimes I dream that he is me. You've got to see that's how I dream to be. I dream, I move, I dream, I groove like Mike. If I could be like Mike. Now, because I was from Oregon, because I grew up in Oregon, I could never sing that song. Me and my friends always had to change it to be, if I could glide like Clyde. But you have to be a Portland Trail Blazer fan to get that one. But this song, they wrote this song that if I could be like Mike. And you know what? All you had to do was drink Gatorade. Drink you a bottle of Gatorade, you can fly through the air, you can make shots no one else can. If you want to be like Mike, just do these simple things. Drink Gatorade. And then dream that you can do what he can do, and suddenly it will happen. If I could be like Mike. I think that we have this same idea about Jesus. If I could be like Jesus, all I have to do is go to church. Or if I could be like Jesus, all I have to do is read my Bible and pray every day. And these are all good things, but the problem is that the way Jesus built that relationship was through a process of discipleship. Those guys that lived with him didn't just every once in a while check in with Jesus and were like, hey, this is just me saying hi today. That's how a lot of our students right now are feeling, I think, because all they have to do is just get online, every once in a while and be like, yes, I am here. For our kids, we're doing homeschooling, and I know this is bad. Laura's going to hit me for this, but we're supposed to check in with the Great Basin, and all we do is just, yes, our kids are in school. Our kids are doing schoolwork today. That's all we have to do. That makes it okay. The school is okay with, all right, they said something. And that's what we've turned our relationship into Jesus with. I'm just checking in today, Jesus. I have a problem. If you don't mind taking care of it, that'd be great. But I'll talk to you again on next Sunday. All right. Have a good week, Jesus. The disciples walked with him, behind him. They slept in the same place as him. They cooked their meals together. They talked to the same people. These disciples had to be not just like Jesus, but they had to learn how to think like Jesus, how to keep up with Jesus. Have you ever stopped and thought about that? Like, was Jesus a fast walker and all the disciples were like, wait, hold on? Or was he a slow walker? Come on, Jesus. We've got to be down. We're supposed to be in Jerusalem in 2 hours, Jesus. Come on, would you please? But they spent the time with him. They didn't just imitate Jesus. They didn't just know about Jesus. They had to move beyond knowing about Jesus to knowing who Jesus was through living with him, through experiencing life with him. See, the problem with mimicking is that it doesn't always work. The other part of that verse from Matthew chapter 7, the verses 22 and 23, Jesus says this, "Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? And in your name did we not drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers." What I get from that is that there are people who Jesus knows and understands will even be able to do things like Jesus. They will be able to perform miracles, to be able to do things that we only dream about. And yet, Jesus says, wait, don't try to say that was for me. Don't try to say that you are looking out for Jesus, for the Father. Don't try to say that you are looking out for anyone but yourselves in those. Those people fall into that same trap of doing all of that stuff just to make sure that they are elevated rather than Jesus. Living like Jesus also doesn't mean that we become rigid rule followers. Sometimes we think that because God gave us all these commandments, not just the 10, but he gave us this whole book, that as long as we follow all the rules, we'll be okay. I mean, yeah, I know Jesus, I know things about him, but I did better than that. I followed all the rules. I did all the things that I could. I earned this. I worked towards it. The problem that you run into is that whenever we believe that we followed the rules, whenever we think that we have done our part, then we also believe that we can say, God, I have done my bit. Don't ask me to do more. God, I did everything you asked. I followed all the rules. I went to church. I did all the things you asked me to do. I went to Bible study. I talked to the right people. I even tried to spread your word. I talked to somebody on the street the other day about you. And we think, there's the limit. God, you can't come in and ask me to do something else because I've already done what I have to. Jesus himself wasn't a rigid rule follower, and maybe some of you are thinking, oh man, Ben's getting crazy. But I mean, Jesus was constantly in trouble because he didn't always follow the rules. That's why the Pharisees always got mad at him. What are you doing healing on a Sabbath? Don't you know you're supposed to be resting? Well, so should they, shouldn't they? This person who has been suffering all their life, shouldn't they be able to rest? Just thought I should help him out with that. We start putting that box around God. when we become rigid rule followers. Don't come at me and say that I'm saying you should be anarchists and don't follow the rules. I'm not saying that. But when that becomes more important than the relationship, I mean, that's any of you who have a spouse, a child. My kids probably hate me because they think that I only want them to follow the rules. But that's not how I got to know them. That's not how I got to know my wife. That's not how I get to know my friends, by saying, well, you have to do all these things. The commands that God gives, it's not just a rigid set of rules, but it's a way of living in order to make sure that people are taken care of and that God is lifted high. But again, we get scared. We get scared when we can't say, God, you can't ask me to do that, because then God can ask us to do anything. When it's an actual relationship, and rather than just knowing facts about Jesus or following the rules or having some mystical experience, when it's more than just that, when it's a relationship, then God can actually expect us to do things we don't want to do. He can expect us to have to give up things, or he can expect us to actually talk to our enemies and love them rather than put them down. One of the things that I've been reading lately, or rereading, was the book Radical. And there's a chapter in there talking about we always explain away the rich young ruler, because he comes and says, I've done all these good things. I've followed all the rules. What more do I need in order to inherit eternal life? And Jesus says, sell everything. Come and follow me. I don't want Jesus to have that say over me. I don't want Jesus to be able to come and say, look, I'm glad that you have a nice house. I'm glad that you have a car that runs. I'm glad that you have food every night. But it's time to set those aside. I'm not even saying Jesus would do that for all of us. I'm just saying that the possibility that he could do that scares the living snot out of all of us, at least a lot of us. Jesus could really expect me to give up my comfort, my happiness, in order to follow him? To live in a way where I love him so much and I trust him so much that if he actually does ask me to go to a different country, or if he asks me to actually go talk to my neighbor, I'm willing to do it? It's scary. That is truly scary. Living like Jesus means that we allow him to build a relationship with us, that we put in the time and the effort, not just to know facts, not just to follow the rules, not just to hope and pray that God eventually moves our spirit enough that we feel like we've been in the presence of God. But it's a daily act of changing how we think. I appreciate things like, what would Jesus do? It was fun to see a craze go across our nation where people were asking WWJD, right? But what if, instead of having to ask that silly question of what would Jesus do, we actually thought like Jesus did? What if we actually didn't have to ask ourselves the question, but already knew and understood that Jesus has laid out how we're supposed to live, that Jesus has taught us how to treat the people around us, or to think about who God is and how he would have us live? I guess what I was getting from John and what I want to pass on to you this morning is that most of the time when we claim to know people, again, we're trying to raise ourselves up. We're trying to be important by association. We're trying to make sure that people think we are valuable because of the people we know. But living like Jesus means taking a step back and knowing that the more we know Jesus, the more that we live like Jesus, the less famous we become. The more that we live like Jesus, the more that we think less about ourselves. Not that we think less of who we are, but we just literally think less about ourselves during the day. And we start to think more about Jesus. And we start to think more about the people he loves. Living like Jesus means that we don't focus on ourselves, but we begin to focus on Jesus. Because how did he live? What were his commands? Jesus, being in very nature God, humbled himself and became a servant. Living like Jesus means being a servant. Who does a servant think about? Does a servant constantly think about themselves, or do they think about the person that they are working for? Are they worried about fulfilling the needs of the person they work for? That's what becomes more important. That becomes the basis of life. How can I make sure that instead of me being known, Jesus is known? If I am serving him, if I am doing what he has commanded, then I should focus less on me, and I should focus more on the things around me. Focus more on Jesus. And that's what I want us to do. That's the thing I want us to work on, is that are we doing things, are we living in a way that makes people focus on us? Making sure that we have a good reputation, that people think well of us, or are we living in a way that doesn't make people think much about us at all, except that they want to know who Jesus is? Are we living in a way that doesn't put focus on us, but puts focus on Jesus? Are we living in a way that gives Jesus a good reputation? Or are we living in a way that gives us a good reputation? John says, walk this way. Do you really know who Jesus is? Then walk this way. Let's pray.